Hello, I'm Alison Cretney, Managing Director of the Energy Futures Lab. So I'm your moderator for today's session, Beyond Technology, Exploring the Role of Social Innovation in Energy Transition. So as engineers or developers, I think we can tend to get really focused on the technology, seeing technology at times as the answer to the multitude of challenges we face today, whether tackling climate change or transitioning our energy system or addressing some of the economic crises before us or social issues. We can fall into the trap of thinking that we really just need to develop and launch more technological solutions into the world. And I refer to this thinking as a trap, partly to be a bit provocative, because in today's session, we're going to explore what else it takes beyond the technology. So I'll be asking, assuming your technology works, what else might get in the way? And for this conversation today, I'm really pleased to be joined by 5 fellows of the Energy Futures Lab, who I'll introduce shortly. Next slide. But first, a little bit on who we are and where we come from, and a few pieces just to set up today's conversation. So the Energy Futures Lab is based in Alberta, Western Province in Canada, and really an energy center within Canada. And this is a group of diverse energy innovators and leading organizations focused on accelerating transition to the energy system of the future. Next slide. So it is intentionally designed as a platform to support collaboration to advance projects that are needed for a prosperous and net zero energy future, initiatives that no single organization can advance on its own. And so the Energy Futures Lab was created in 2015 with the premise that tackling the complexity and polarization of today's energy challenges requires a true diversity of perspectives and abilities. So at the heart of the Energy Futures Lab are its fellows. This is a very diverse and carefully curated group of over 70 leaders from across the province's energy system, which includes oil and gas, utilities, there's clean tech entrepreneurs, renewable energy developers, environmentalists, Indigenous leaders, municipal government, economic developers, IT, finance, professors, there's artists, and much more. So it's a very colorful group. Next slide. And so in addition to the fellows, the Energy Futures Lab is supported in various ways by 20 convening partners, which themselves are a representation and a reflection of some of the diversity in the energy system as well. Next slide. I share this visual, it's rather simplistic, but to give a sense of the way of working that happens within the Energy Futures Lab. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, hopefully this provides a little bit of a shortcut, albeit overly simplistic. So the image on the left-hand side is showing participants coming into the Energy Futures Lab. So fellows in the early days who come in with very different ideas about how to move forward, about what the problem is. I mean, that's the reality of any complex challenge, and certainly energy transition is one of those. Very different ideas of what the solutions might be, or how a future energy system should look. And so then the middle picture kind of represents a bit of the lab experience, which does include sometimes literally sitting in a circle together, but really it's about really listening to one another and trying hard to understand one another's perspectives, however different they are from their own. And doing the hard work of building trust and social capital across traditional boundaries. And an early win that came out of that working together was developing a shared vision for a future energy system. But ultimately, as depicted on the image on the right, it's really about getting people actually doing things together. So we identifying places where there's common interest for working together, and that's really what the circles on the far right represent, groups of collaborators, all headed, more or less in a common direction towards that shared vision, but the arrows really are intentionally not entirely aligned, because the reality is not everyone agrees on everything, and there's no expectation of that. That's, trying to seek that will ultimately only slow things down, but the idea of a general alignment in a common direction and an orientation towards trying to find areas where there's enough common interest in order to move something forward together. Next slide. So this show this briefly. I'm not going to talk about the content here, but just to say, when I talked about that shared vision, this is essentially the lab's answer to what Alberta's energy system could look like in 2050, originally developed in response to the question of, how could we leverage our leadership position in today's energy system to create the energy system of the future. So this provides a bit of an anchor point or sort of North Star for some of the innovation work in the lab. Next slide. And here's a quick snapshot of the current portfolio of projects. So those little circles that were on the far right of the previous diagram. And, this at any given time, there's an active portfolio of, say, a dozen or 15 collaborative projects. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about the couple that are bolded there today, because some of the fellows who've been working on those are joining us today. Next slide. So I just want to share 2 additional slides just to help set up today's conversation. This exploration of the role of social innovation in energy transition. So just a little bit on social innovation. So there's lots of groups working on technological innovation required for our shifting energy system, which is really important and necessary. But as we'll be exploring today, I'd assert that there's equally an importance to attend to the many non-technical barriers that can slow tech adoption and scaling. In a relatively perhaps familiar example, Thomas Edison's success wasn't ultimately because he invented a light bulb, a new technology, but because of an awareness of the needing to revamp an entire system to make the shift from gas to electric lighting over 100 years ago. So it's really the right conditions, technical of course, but beyond that, looking at competitiveness or social or policy or cultural, all these things needing to be in place for real uptake. So when we're referring to social innovation that's needed, it can mean, for example, developing solutions that could foster political acceptance or public support, or that can clear regulatory barriers, or attract new investment or new financing mechanisms, perhaps developing new business models. So today we'll be inviting you to think beyond technological challenges. Always coming back to that question, if your technology works, what else might be getting in the way? And one last, next slide. So one final piece I wanted to share that underpins some of the thinking and approach in the Energy Futures Lab, which is informed by the work of Frank Giels, a Dutch researcher. It speaks to the importance of taking a systems view to your challenge, particularly in a complex and dynamic environment. So at the bottom of this diagram is the realm of the innovators and entrepreneurs developing new technologies and solutions. Next slide. Yet so often these solutions bump up against significant barriers in the system. In mainstream institutions like industry or government, again, bumping into regulatory barriers or unfriendly policy environments, inability to attract investment to a new idea. So enabling and increasing adoption and uptake, there really needs to be attention to creating a fertile ground out there in the broader system of industry and markets and policy environment. And I think this is true for innovations coming from individual entrepreneurs or startups, as well as often within some of these big institutions. Next slide. And a level above that is the broader culture that all this exists within. So recognizing that significant barrier that culture can create, for example, related to politics or resistance to electric vehicles, or the long and largely unproductive battle between oil and gas and renewables. Often broad uptake of a new innovation or technology also requires an accompanying shift in culture or mindset. And sometimes this might look like sharing new stories or narratives about these possibilities and new ideas, as we've needed to do in Alberta. And sometimes it might be working directly with communities to help them connect with opportunities around what's changing and opportunities in an energy transition. Next, and at the very top of the diagram is the global context, and these massive landscape events, such as the pandemic we find ourselves in, that we can't hope to influence, but we do need to track and be aware of and be prepared to adapt to. So, a takeaway as well, looking at this, is that most importantly, it's also about attending to those interactions between those different levels across stakeholder groups of innovators and business and government and public and communities is critically important. So next slide. So with that, let's dive in. I'd like to introduce you to the 5 fellows of the Energy Futures Lab who are joining today to share from their experience from working on different projects, both within and beyond the Energy Futures Lab. They are Candice Paton, Matt Beck, Julie Bunker, Brad Nickel, and Barend Dronkers. And so we'll be hearing about a 5-minute opening presentation from each fellow to help set the stage, and then we'll be moving into a panel discussion. So first up, actually next slide. So first up is Candice Paton, Director of Regulatory Affairs and External Relations with Enhance Energy, a company specializing in carbon capture and sequestration. Candice is also co-host of the podcast For the Sake of Argument, exploring what makes critical conversation and debate so challenging in today's world. Welcome, Candice.
Thank you so much, Allison. Next slide, please. I want to take a couple of minutes and just share with you a little bit about what we're doing today at Enhance Energy. And then I'm going to move on to a new project that we're starting with a collaborative group, but it's part of where I think we need to go tomorrow. So right now, we have this really neat project in Alberta. It's a carbon capture, transportation, and sequestration project that is currently sequestering about a quarter of all of the emissions that Canada is sequestering today. And so this project was developed over the last more than 10 years. Enhance Energy was the founder of the Alberta Carbon Trunkline Project, and it works with partners in the upstream large emitters, with our partners Northwest Redwater Partnership, who run a sturgeon refinery, Nutrien, who runs a fertilizer plant in northern Alberta. We work with Wolf Carbon Solutions, who own and operate a 240-kilometer pipeline that is dedicated and built specifically for CO2 transport. And then Enhance Energy is at the end of that pipeline, sequestering emissions permanently into Alberta's geology and running a utilization enhanced oil recovery project at the same time. This is such a neat project because working together from stack to geology with different partners is a really neat model of showing how multiple users can connect into existing infrastructure and common solutions to reduce emissions and to find solutions for CO2. We're really excited. Over the last year, we've sequestered over 1.5 million tons of CO2, and we want to grow and see a thriving carbon management ecosystem in Alberta. Next slide, please. So this brings me to a new project called the Alberta Carbon Hub. And we think this is kind of neat because places around the world are talking about carbon capture and storage hubs as a neat model of how to really get large-scale emissions reductions deployed. And so Alberta is also looking at the idea of hubs. And when we work with our group of industry partners and other people in the community, we talk about what makes a hub. A hub can be a place, a hub can be a thing. But what really inspires us around the idea of a hub is the idea of connection and the idea of collaboration and working together that brings energy and enthusiasm to the objectives that we're trying to achieve. Allison talked about how, we've got to think beyond just the technology. You can assume your technology works. And in the case of CCS, carbon capture and storage, or CCUS, carbon capture utilization storage, we know they work. They've been operating in some cases for over 75 years in different types of technology deployments. We've got hundreds of locations of EOR around the world. We're starting to see CCS hubs pop up. So we know the technology works. We've got a lot of data and information and evidence that this is a really good, safe, permanent way of dealing with emissions. But what else is getting in our way? Why haven't we seen the proliferation of these projects when we know that CCS contributes a very necessary part to the global emissions reductions we need to see on our path to net zero? And so this is the genesis of the Alberta Carbon Hub project. The idea that we need to collaborate, we need to talk to people, we need to celebrate things that are happening today, and we need to give people a sense of confidence that there are technology solutions that will help us meet our climate change goals. Next slide, please. So we've gotten together with a group of 8 like-minded companies, and the message and the objective here is really to talk to people at their kitchen tables about CCS, about CCUS, what it means for our jurisdiction, who's doing what now, what real projects are happening today that help give us that confidence that we can see real progress going forward. And so we call ourselves a bit of a strange brew. We're everything from a craft brewery in central Alberta to Clean O2, who is capturing emissions from commercial facilities in cities and towns and converting those CO2 products into soap and other cleansers that can be sold in a market, to large companies like Capital Power and Lafarge, to organizations like Carbon Management Canada, who've been working around the safety and security and the understanding of our geology and how do we monitor things. Svante is a capture partner who's got a neat technology that they can deploy all over the place to help companies find ways to make sure they've got solutions for their emissions. And then Enhance Energy is one of those that has the expertise in the geology and how do we permanently sequester. We've all got a story to tell, and what we're really excited about is that it's a today story to tell. There's real projects happening right now, and we want to get these stories out to people and to answer questions and to help show that the way forward is through many different approaches. CCS is certainly one of them, and there's many different ways to do that that all help to contribute. Next slide, please. So we've just launched the Alberta Carbon Hub. You can go to our website, learn a little bit more. There's great resources linked there. And the message is that, anything's possible when we work together. We've got stories and connections to CCUS. It's a neat celebration of what we're doing together. And we're starting to try and reach more people so that they can ask questions and think about how this fits in with all of the other technology solutions that are going to be needed to get us to net zero. November 16th to 18th, we'll be having a webinar series that connects people directly with the Carbon Hub collaborators. And so there's a lot of opportunities for individuals to get involved and learn more through this network. I'd encourage any of you to reach out on LinkedIn and see how your story or your message can be involved in the Alberta Carbon Hub. So I will leave it there, and looking forward to the panel discussion in a few minutes.
Thank you, Candice. Next up, I'd like to introduce you to Matt Beck. He is actually now Senior Director of Net Zero Strategy Services with the Delphi Group, where he advises many of Canada's largest companies on the intersection of their industry and impacting on climate. And I think your change in title, Matt, actually, I think is quite apt given the significant shift we've seen towards interest and commitments of net zero, and this particularly in the last year and a half in Canada. So welcome.
Thanks, Allison. Yeah, so I didn't prepare some slides today because I just wanted to kind of focus on this higher level social innovation component. We tap into a few things that Candice referenced and you also described in your introduction around how we move innovation through different layers in the system. One of the areas that I see as critical to any efforts in sustainability, and we've seen sustainability progress accelerate or be impeded by this dynamic over many years as we've moved towards more and more climate action and more action on water and land issues, is this idea of our corporations, companies, society exists in this world where at the intersection of the technical solutions we bring to the table that advance our ability to solve these problems and the very real social networks and connections that we have inside and across our organizations. And this is a digital conference. It's about how these digital technologies contribute to energy transition, energy transformation, and our goals, maybe internally to our companies or more broadly, nationally, internationally. And so one area that I think of a lot when I think of how social innovation can be factored into getting us past just having great tech is to think about what's happened in the information security space and all these interesting stories about ransomware and hacking and things like that. And one of the things we hear about a lot in that space is social engineering. And the traditional story is, some hacker calls up someone inside a company and they talk friendly, represent themselves as a fellow colleague who just needs a favor done or something, and makes it seem like it's no big deal to get access to a system. Well, that's social engineering for, nefarious means, black hat hacking, things like that. But we can learn lessons from the tools and techniques that social engineers use in that context. Or if we bring it back even further, some of the earliest examples of social engineering in the literature come from none other than the likes of folks like Karl Popper and his work on the structure of how societal ideas shift, how science evolves, the ideas of creative destruction. And he talks about using social engineering on a broad scale, on a society scale, to shift the culture. So this is operating, bringing it back to that Heels model that Allison presented at that highest level, culture shift level, where we're actually capturing and tapping into the zeitgeist of the day, right? And so that obviously takes initiative and effort at a different scale than the everyday type of social engineering that hackers tend to use. But if we think about these mechanisms in this context, and we think about, what that might mean for the proliferation of the ideas of this technology, of the context of how can I make it so stupidly easy to use new technology that it just seems like a no-brainer. One anecdote that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, I'm thinking back on when my friends and colleagues maybe 5 years ago, I could maybe name one or two that were excited about electric vehicles, that had one and were driving it, and everybody else was kind of like looking on the sidelines, notionally interested, but there's a lot of questions about range anxiety and like, if I go on a long trip, am I gonna have to wait forever to recharge? And these stories start percolating out about, oh, well, yeah, you're right, I do have to plug in when I'm in Alberta, I'm in Calgary, and people drive between Calgary and Edmonton all the time, right? And so, oh yeah, I have to stop halfway and grab a cup of coffee and let my vehicle charge up, but no big deal, I've adjusted my behavior. Now, 5 years on, that has become the dominant narrative, and most of the people that you talk to who drive EVs, which is a significantly larger portion of my social network now, I hear people saying, yeah, I've shifted my behavior. I really don't notice it. It's not a big deal. And from that, we can see the culture shifting. Now, we could cast that example into the future and think about how that might play out in an electricity system that is very highly weighted towards renewable power, that maybe has some variability to it, right? And people are like, oh, well, we need baseload, we need baseload. I wonder how much baseload we actually need if people are going to adapt their behavior, if organizations are going to adapt their behavior. If the alternative is very, very high cost baseload power versus abundant, plentiful, cheap, clean, renewable power with some variability to it, where's that tipping point where the cost shifts from focusing, optimizing your operations 24/7 for baseload to saying, actually, you know what, we can adjust our output based on when the power is available. I expect we're going to see a lot more of that kind of behavior shifting. And if we can think about those type of social dynamics to how we interact with our energy system, we can really get into much more rapid conversation and iteration around how we can deploy these new technologies that are clean and more effective at energy transition.
Thank you, Matt. Lots to think about there. Great opening comments. Next slide, please, Emily. So next up, we are joined by Julie Bunker, who has been supporting the lab's Energy AI initiative since earlier this year. So Julie today will be sharing some of the work and learnings from that initiative, focused on nurturing solutions really at the intersection of digital innovation, energy, and communities. And Julie's career throughout, she's worked with a diverse range of players across the energy sector to really understand various perspectives of energy transition that span the grid. So welcome, Julie. Looking forward to having you here today.
Thank you so much, Allison. I want to talk about our Energy AI initiative within the lab. And for the last several years, the initiative has engaged with hundreds of thought leaders and innovators from across sectors to explore how digital innovation can be leveraged in energy transition in Alberta. This is from AI and machine learning in our oil and gas sector to blockchain solutions for community generation opportunities. But this past year, we started off by focusing our efforts on an area of great need where there's a lot of action and a lot of interest in energy transition, and that is at the community level. Next slide, please. We initially set out with a purpose: to mobilize the ecosystem of stakeholders needed to unlock digital innovation solutions that help Alberta and its communities thrive in its energy transition. But it wasn't long before we made an important addition, and that is to explore the social innovation and adding that to our mission. And I'll tell you the story of why. Next slide, please. We started by sensing the system, exploring real-world opportunities, challenges, and examples from the community lens with selected community reps from communities ranging in size, thought leaders, and innovators from across sectors. We heard from communities who were utilizing local solar generation for carbon offsets. Another was leveraging digital innovation for their transit systems, or using it to manage local battery storage. Collectively, the group identified some key barriers and opportunities for leveraging digital innovation in Alberta communities and what the root causes and influences were. For the barriers, we heard things like polarization, public perceptions, lack of alignment, resistance to change, risk adverse. And on the opportunity side of things, we heard leadership, creating narratives, building a business case, creating equitable energy solutions, collaboration, supportive policy. And this was coming from quite a technical group of individuals to start with. This told us that the root of moving the needle for leveraging digital innovation in communities is actually social, not technical in nature, and needs to be addressed at the system level. Next slide. Through a very open and constructive dialogue, which the lab is noted for, we explored big questions around these barriers and opportunities, like how do we economically and equitably support the grid as more people generate their own power? Who is ultimately responsible for grid modernization? Who pays? Who takes on those risks? And why is it so hard to collaborate on big change? This helped to identify common and important problem areas and pointed to what really needs to be addressed to leverage digital innovation at the community level. And that was a need for collaboration, shared responsibility, and equity in energy transition. Next slide, please. We went through a system mapping exercise which revealed the complexity of our current system and the nature of social innovation. And this is just a snapshot of us exploring one of the three problem areas. So as you can see, social innovation it's messy, it's complex, because humans are. We built upon the problem areas to identify fundamental system changes needed to our current reality, and we learned about some promising opportunities and solutions from other regions. We then had our group of thought leaders brainstorm some bold ideas for innovation and collaboration to address these key areas of need around collaboration, shared responsibility, and equity in the energy transition. Next slide. After a collective vote, we landed on 5 bold ideas that were born from this work. and serve as meaningful digital and social innovation opportunities for the identified problem areas. They focus around grid modernization task force, integrating demand-side management into our utility systems, virtual metering as a tool for community generation, building a customer and provider relationship around electricity programs and products, and a concierge for accelerating grid solutions. These ideas focus on removing the barriers, creating new business models, creating narratives, bridging gaps, connecting, and collaborating. The idea leads from across the different sectors, are currently working with our energy AI team to further build the connections and awareness in the ecosystem to help advance these ideas in a meaningful way. Next slide. So this brings me back around to my first slide. Through the last year, we've seen and explored how innovation is often seems technical, but through every successful technology must also address people's needs and respond well to the surrounding social, economic, and cultural conditions. So it sheds new perspective on our approach to mobilize the ecosystem of stakeholders to explore social innovations needed to unlock digital innovation solutions that help Alberta and its communities thrive in its energy transition. Next slide. I'd also like to thank our initiative funder, RBC Foundation, for their continued support and trust in our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. And now I'd like to welcome Brad Nichols. Brad is a business opportunity specialist with Equus-RIA, which has the distinction of being Canada's largest member-owned utility. And something that I've heard Brad share before, so I'm suspecting you won't mind me sharing today. A unique fact about Brad is that he's an engineer who actually enjoys talking to people, as you'll probably experience today.
Yes, and also people don't enjoy talking to me, but that's okay. It's not always mutual. So it was interesting today, as you notice with these different speakers, you kind of think everyone kind of has a different perspective. And that's very intentional with the lab, where you see some people are up at that cultural landscape, some people are at the regime, and some people are in the niche. And so that's very much by design. And so today I want to kind of talk about my experience within the electricity sector, because I've spent my whole career now working in the electricity utilities sector, and kind of what I see the challenges of social innovation within the electricity sector. And just when I was looking at this conference synopsis, when we're talking about digital twins, AR, VR, XR, immersive learning, artificial intelligence, IoT, these are a lot of very popular buzzwords right now. But what does it mean when it comes to culture? And I think that's where, when we forget about that aspect, and especially the specific culture of utilities and people's interaction with electricity. And a lot of the adoption, people kind of fall down, because I know we talked about change and people changing the behavior, but ultimately how people feel is what drives behavior change, right? There's a big difference about when you go to charge an electric car, and that makes you feel a certain way. And that essentially changes culture. And so there's been lots of really good technical innovations that have failed spectacularly because culturally they weren't appropriate at the time. So a great example of that is segways. They're great, they worked, but they made you look like an idiot, right? Like, that fundamentally why segways failed is they made you look like an utter idiot. Like, you cannot look cool on a Segway, and it's scientifically proven. Like, you can't, you can put on fancy hats and no one's going to care. You're still going to look like a bit of a weirdo. The other good one is the Google Glasses. Another great innovation, technologically amazing what was accomplished there, but culturally creepy. They created a product that just does not work with the culture, right? And I fear that energy has a bit of a different problem, not in the sense that it's a privacy issue, but definitely there's some cultural hang-ups on privacy. But there's all these kind of narratives. Electricity is pervasive. No one cares. Like, truly, that's why I was going to remind myself when I'm giving presentations, I'm truly the only one that cares about what I'm talking about. No one else cares, right? And so when you're trying to come up with innovation electricity, No one cares. It's not sexy. It doesn't really, and most people don't even think we have a problem because it still works, right? So how do you get someone to adapt a more sophisticated metering, get into blockchain, or even accommodate having a nuclear reactor sitting next to you in your house, right? When you don't even understand there's an issue, you don't even care, right? And so I think when you're an innovator and you're looking at these things, take a chance to map out how this could fail culturally. What are the cultural aspects that could completely crush what you're trying to do and preconceived notion? Because I would say that there's some stuff that is pretty stronger than you realize. You know, I think most people's education on nuclear energy has been really two things. Things blowing up, Fukushima, Chernobyl, right? Not great publicity, but you know, all publicity is good publicity, but I'm not sure if that applies to nuclear disasters. And then Blinky from The Symptoms. The next greatest educator for nuclear energy is Blinky, the three-eyed fish. And so when you think of that, you know, it may seem ridiculous off the start, but that's how people feel about nuclear power, right? It blows up and it leaks into the environment constantly, right? And that's most people's baseline feel. Now, they may not acknowledge that from a specific conversation, but a lot of these times, these are the cultural undertones we have to look at when we're innovating, when you're bringing these technologies in. And so when we look at specifically in electricity and utilities, I think there's definitely an aspect of innovation where people miss the mark, especially being, I've worked for large utilities, in the past, and you get this stream of entrepreneurs that come in, and the first miss is regime. They don't understand how utilities get paid, which is kind of funny because we don't actually make money by saving customers money. The vast majority. It's a bit different now because I work for a member-owned co-op, so absolutely, that's how we get paid. But a lot of shareholder-owned utilities, market structures aren't that. So understand specifically how these organizations make money. And then the other thing is you walk in there thinking this is just they're money hungry organizations, that's all they care about. And that's not the case. I think utilities, especially for the good and the bad, are not necessarily they don't have the culture of a necessary for-profit company. They're more of a culture of a tribe. People take a lot of pride in what they do. And lots of the time, it's very common to have people in utilities have multi-generational. Like, so people's parents will work there, even grandparents had worked there. It's very common to see that. And that type of intergenerational stuff starts to create cultures, right? And so when you're looking at innovation and trying to get these innovations into a utility, if you think of them as a for-profit business that just wants to make a buck, you're going to probably have your innovation shut down pretty quickly, because you got to look at it as a tribe of people that has culture and traditions based on the pride. People in utilities take a huge pride in keeping the lights on. It's the unofficial mantra. Everyone gets it tattooed on their lower backs. Well, maybe not, but that's the level of pride people have in a utility. So when you come in with an innovative solution that's going to destroy that, you've got to take that to a mirror of, you're going to a tribe in Nepal that makes the most beautiful reed baskets in the world. These things are marvelous. All the communities around them revere these baskets for their quality because they use them to harvest their crops in. And it's been done for centuries. It's the purpose and the value of that basket is far beyond the economic impact of it. That is a bit like how a utility does it. So when you look at saying, hey, you should switch to plastic because they'd be a tenth of the price and they'd last forever, you've got to really understand what that means to the culture and the people there. And how would you approach that problem? Because it's very different than, here, just buy this, it's cheaper, it'll work better. You got to look at the culture and the culture effects. So kind of to wrap it all up is, culture is very important, but tangibly, you need to look at your situation to see how culture is going to shut you down. And it's a very challenging exercise. So a good example is, if you start to talk to people in your day-to-day life outside your echo chamber, and you can't explain to them or get them excited. And what I mean is feel. It all comes down to feel, because culture is about feelings. And that's an interesting thing for an engineer to say, because maybe I read it in a book once, but it comes down to the feel. What does this make you feel? That is culture. So if someone says, this makes me feel this way, that's culture, because it's not logical. It's not tied up in anything. It's based on a whole cultural imprint. So how does it make you feel? So you got to ask yourself when you talk to people about what you're doing, how does it make them feel, right? Does it make them feel excited, hesitant, scared, right? That is really the indication of what you're doing. And then you got to look at how do you address that feeling. And if your solution is to educate, I guarantee you're going to fail, because it can't be about education. It has to be about changing how someone feels, because that's how culture shifts, right? That's how that EV goes from being just sitting there and feeling bad about having to charge to feeling proud to have the time, because it's that shift in how you feel in the activity, right? Like if I drive a hybrid car, I love it when I brake because it gives me charge. I don't know why. I get tingly sensations all over, right? But before, when I drive a gas car, I may not even notice that, right? So it changed how I feel about it, then changes the culture and so on and so forth. So that's what I just wanted to wrap up and say, is that culture is important, the feelings are important, and if you ever hear feel, trigger in, it's culture. So I'll pass it back here to Allison to go to the next person.
Very well said, Brad. Thank you. I sense a juicy discussion coming up, but just before we get there, our final speaker, I look forward to introducing Barend Dronkers, who is the lead analyst for distributed energy resources with eSource, is also the co-founder and manager of the Grid Sandbox project, which he'll be presenting on today. Over to you, Barend.
Thank you very much, Allison. I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about what I do at eSource and the Grid Sandbox project. So before I launch into the Grid Sandbox, I've been working with eSource now since May this year. It's an awesome organization. Essentially what we do is we help organizations like Equus, the utility that's owned by cooperative members where Brad works, realize their energy transition. So, and the energy transition in this context is decarbonizing the grid, building a clean grid that's affordable, that's equitable, which is a really big, important pillar of how we're going to decarbonize essentially our planet, not just energy systems, but food systems. And part of that equation is developing a very clean electric grid that's still affordable and that everyone has access to. So that's what I work on. And the Grid Sandbox project materialized from a lot of that bonding and dialogue, collaboration with other Energy Futures Lab fellows, one of whom couldn't make it, but I worked closely with another fellow, Prageet Nibber, who's the CEO of Rewatt Power. If you could go to the next slide. And so with Rewatt Power and another company also based in Alberta, BrainToy, also working with Volta Research, a company based in Ontario, we've developed a Grid Sandbox platform, or should I say we are in the process of developing a Grid Sandbox platform. The sandbox is derivative of something that's broadly known as an innovation sandbox. It's a policy tool that generally relies on collaboration to solve innovative problems in complex systems. And so in this case, the complex system that we're very excited and interested in is the electric system and the utilities that operate within. And so we've taken that idea of an innovation sandbox where you can experiment in a safe space with new ideas and come up with new solutions, business models to deliver services to customers. So customers are the folks like you and me, businesses that need energy, that want clean energy as part of that energy transition. And we've digitized it. So we've created a space that we think allows utilities like Equus to come up with new solutions that their customers need and want. But really also the most important part here is to engage and work with the customers on those solutions, which I think is critical to introducing those niche innovations that Allison introduced at the start through the regime level, in changing the culture, because if you come up with solutions with the folks that are going to use them, those are the kind of solutions that will last and embed themselves in the cultural environment. Next slide. So I've talked a little bit about why we need an electric grid that's clean and decarbonized. A large part of our current emissions is with our transport systems and our buildings. So if we can develop a clean electric grid that doesn't produce any carbon to fuel the vehicles that we move around in, and to heat and cool and power the buildings that we live and work in, we've solved a large part of how we're going to decarbonize the energy system. Not the full part. So Candice talked a lot about some of the other parts of the energy system that need different solutions as well. But the focus here is the electric grid. And I talk about how that electric grid it's a complex system. It's developed over 100 years. And you know, it's been built and added to over that 100-year period. As well, it's not necessarily a free-for-all Wild West. It's a regulated environment. And one of the things that I appreciated that Brad touched on is how utilities make money. And it made me think of the concept of a benefit corporation and how regulatory schemes are essentially established to ensure that what is otherwise kind of a monopoly, where you've got poles and wires that deliver the electrons to your home, and there really is only one set of poles and wires. It's not economic to build, you know, 3 sets of poles and wires, each owned by a separate company, to deliver that energy to you. So what a benefit corporation does is it serves a purpose. And historically, a company may have had a singular purpose, which was to make money for the shareholders. And these days, more and more so, companies, they do and they want to do a lot more than just making money. They want to serve a purpose for someone. And I think a utility company and retail energy providers serve a purpose to realize this energy transition. And we want, with the Grid Sandbox, to provide a tool, an online platform that allows them to realize that purpose with real people, using the real-time energy data that's made available from those people to create new and innovative solutions for the grid. So I'll end this slide with the analogy where as more and more people plug in their electric car, as more people plug in heat pumps to heat and cool their building, that's going to be a huge new load on the grid. So imagine if you have a highway that's been built and you have a traffic jam. So there's rush hour, there's only so many cars that can hit the road. So instead of having all the cars hit the road during rush hour between 5 and 7, you can spread out all those cars across the course of the day so that everyone has a pleasant driving experience. So basically, this is a similar problem that we face with the grid. If everyone switches on their heating or cooling equipment at the same time, everyone comes home, plugs in their EV at the end of the day, we need a way to manage the traffic on the grid, just like managing the cars on the highway. More so, we have a problem where the grid, we add all these new loads and we continue to expand. It's kind of like adding service roads on that highway, where you keep adding more and more cars and people start adding cars in different spots on the highway that previously the highway wasn't planned for. So again, to me, that illustrates the problem of, well, everyone uses the system, so why don't we collaborate with everyone to solve the problems that are inherent in that system. Next slide. So traditionally, and across North America right now, every state and province, except for, unfortunately, our home province of Alberta, where I'm speaking to you from now, has some form of demand-side management which could include energy efficiency, solar storage, electric vehicles, managed electric vehicle charging. All these jurisdictions in North America, except for Alberta, have these services for incentivizing and financing and integrating these solutions into the grid is embedded in the utility system. So that's something we're working on in Alberta. But even these utilities that have the opportunity to incentivize energy efficiency in North America, it takes a long time to first design a program that delivers energy efficiency, then to pilot it, then to evaluate it. And next thing you know, you've spent all this money doing something that doesn't work at all. Like the evaluation shows that what you just did isn't going to move the needle on electrifying the grid. So it's a very linear, long, drawn-out, multi-year process that doesn't really enable collaboration because you're not designing it in partnership with the folks that are going to be consuming the energy efficiency service. More so, the data that you collect and evaluate is probably a couple of years old by the time that you're done with your program cycle. Next slide. Next slide. So one of the advantages of the Grid Sandbox, previous slide. Sorry, I said that too many times. So one of the advantages of the Grid Sandbox is that it's a faster, more collaborative, and low-risk solution because it brings in the customer into the design process, the continuous evolution of delivering energy efficiency, distributed energy resources, demand response services, so the grid needs some flexibility as well. And it uses the real energy data from those customers to inform decisions that the utility can make to tweak the services. So it's fast, it's collaborative, which I think is the ethos of the Energy Futures Lab, and it doesn't require those big lumpy investments over long cycles. Next slide. I think I've talked a lot. I don't have a complete measure of the time, so I'm going to stop here. But I will just leave this slide here for a second, that it is a very collaborative platform that we're building. It's with Rewatt Power in Alberta. It's with BrainToy. They've developed this amazing machine learning environment that we'll be leveraging to enable the platform. And we're really excited to be this platform that we can use in Alberta to build a business case for integrating demand side management into the utility system. Thanks.
Thank you, Barend. Thank you all. This is a very exciting way to start off. So much to dig into here. I think where I'm going to begin is there was a lot of different references to culture just now throughout, certainly a common thread throughout the conversation, which I think is no surprise because it's something that really is top of mind for us at the Energy Futures Lab, recognizing how often it can slow things down and or be a very significant enabler. And I was hearing like challenges with, we can't expect everyone to care, for example. Some people are just not engaged. And, Matt described it, well, then we need to make it stupidly easy to use. We talked about, Brad really highlighted lists for feelings as one of the signals that we're kind of in that cultural realm. It really has to matter how the solution feels to those who are hoping might adopt it. And that's both within organizations as well as the consumer end. But I think all of the energy conversation has been very, very, very polarized in Alberta, and I would say carbon capture and storage I think is a great example where there's a very large spectrum, Candice, of different views on that, from it being a really obvious and exciting solution to this fear that it's somehow going to just enable industry to sort of continue on the same track, essentially. Some people might refer to it as an excuse for oil and gas, those types of things. Very strong views on a whole spectrum there. And I would love to just dig in a little bit more. I'll pose to you first, Candice, and then would love to hear from others. When we're working in really polarized spaces, sometimes, and one thing I don't think I actually heard the word from anyone today, but there's also an identity piece, I think, in this. People can really, what underlies those feelings often is a deep identity of being in a certain camp or within a certain group or tribe, as one of you mentioned. But in these really polarized spaces, what does work? What is most needed to start to create those bridges or to shift some of that thinking when it's needed in order to enable a new technology or a new idea to land? Candice?
Allison, this is an amazing topic because I think this is what I spend most of my day thinking about when I'm trying to talk to communities about CCS, talk to other people in the energy system who are working to put solutions in place. When I think about polarization, I think it's so good when you're right? Like it's an amazing feeling. Brad's talked about the feels. It feels so good to be right. And so I think that feeling sets us up for a very binary discussion, right? We look for the right answer. We look for the right solution that's going to achieve our goals. And I think with the energy system that we have today, with the energy system we're going to see in the future, it's really messy and complex, and it needs so many different technologies in different embodiments to find the optimal solution. And so nobody gets to be right. Everyone gets to just be a little bit right. And that can be really uncomfortable. And I think about, when I get really excited about CCS, I want to see it everywhere. But, that's not the right answer either. It's an amazing technology to couple with things that are hard to abate. There are going to be so many different shifts in so many different systems, but there are systems that are really difficult to address. And when you have a technology like carbon capture and storage, it's a very proven commercial scale deployable technology that we have today to deal with some of those tricky spaces. And I think I would, challenge folks who are really looking for a silver bullet to look for those, and I mean, we say this all the time, but those yes and solutions. Renewables, yes, where they make the best sense and have the best efficiencies and the least impact to all of the environmental concerns that we have around land and water and other components. Yes to CCS where it makes sense and where we can couple it with the tricky scenarios that are going to help make sure that we're getting solutions today in place. I also think there's a real timeliness that we need to think about. 2050 is coming fast. 2030 is coming even faster. And so I get really excited when we start to put the layers and we talk about regime and niche and landscape, but we also need to look at time horizons and where do we have answers today that can help transition us? Where do we have answers today that can help get us on our road? And then we're going to see all of these new technologies, beautiful solutions that come into play, make the answer even more complex, but get us where we need to go.
Lots of layers there. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question around identity? Looking at you.
Can I jump in on the question of how we break through some of this like entrenchment around identity, like when people's identities are attached to a particular viewpoint in the energy system, and they get kind of stuck there. When we're dealing with things, new technology and a proliferation of all this data, the data becomes pointless in situations like that. You can throw as much data as you want at an entrenched position, and they'll just find ways of discounting that data. So at that point, we've found in some of our work that the best thing to do is to take a step back and actually look at it from a governance perspective and set ground level principles that everybody can align on. What are the criteria that we're looking for to establish what data sources or information that we're bringing to this conversation are of the right quality? If we can agree on those ground rules at the beginning, then it becomes really hard to discount a quality source if everybody agrees that it meets the criteria that were established in the conversation. So sometimes taking that step back and getting the governance right and really kind of taking a bit more time to be more formal and engaging in that conversation can really help people kind of get out of the emotional and into a bit more rational, and sometimes get them over an ideological position. Not always. Sometimes you have to use a few other tools as well, but that's one that we found has worked quite well.
I think it's interesting when we talk about the trying to depolarize the conversation. And I think a large part is how you start the conversation, because I think that's always very ambiguous of what are you talking about, right? Because I know CCS always gets a bad rap because you kind of feel like you're just burying your problems away. So, so the problem to garbage is to throw it in a garbage dump, which I guess gets you somewhere. I guess that's a bit of a good solution, better than throwing it in the ocean, but it's not really a great solution. I think that's where CCS really has challenges culturally, because you just feel like, are we actually solving the problem or are we just hiding it, right? And from a cultural standpoint, people don't necessarily like that, right? The idea that you're just going to go hide it, you're going to go bury it in the ground somewhere. We should take care of it. So I think when we're talking about messaging, it's about how do you actually what is the feeling you're trying to give someone? And it's hilarious that you get the engineering guy here that failed his communication course talking about feelings, but it's about, how do you, what are you presenting? And I truly think CCS will become the fourth utility in the world. We'll need a new utility network that sequesters carbon, because it will absolutely be needed. There's just some applications where it's unavoidable at this point. But I think when you bring that conversation of what is the feeling, so you can talk about CCS and technologically and this and that for an example, or you can say, hey, this is the fourth utility. This is how we're going to build a system that protects the environment, kind of like the sewage, right? Talking about the big stink in London when the first sewage systems came in and what that meant culturally, right? They weren't talking about, they said, this is a cultural revolution. This is going to solve the stink, right? And, in the same way, we can use that same feeling about everyone coming together and working together, which could be a lot more beneficial. So that's why I say with depolarization, it's about talking about the feelings that you want people to have instead of just talking about the tech and what it's going to do. Well, how is it going to make you feel, right? And I think that's something that's really overlooked, because I know I was talking to my in-laws and saying, I'm thinking of getting an EV. Their first reaction was like, do you know that's made out of oil? Well, yeah, no shit. But it's this interesting cultural just knee-jerk reaction, because what I was saying to them, right, was very different than the message they were receiving, right? It was an innocent remark, right? But on the other hand, I can depolarize that conversation about talking about the feelings of it. And the feelings for them was, hey, it's going to save me a pile of money. And all of a sudden the conversation changed, right? I didn't talk about the science. I didn't talk about, well, you can sequester those emissions and let's talk about the education. Let me get you this study where we compare life cycle costs. No, it's not worth it. Talk about the feelings.
Yeah, I recently had a
conversation about feelings.
Oh, no, well, I have talks about feelings all the time, Brad.
Oh,
Apparently,
good.
I wear my emotions on my sleeve, as my close ski friend, Jeremy, always tells me. But I posted something on Facebook about high gas prices. And jokingly, being from the Netherlands, I said that, well, $1.40 per liter really isn't anything at all. In the Netherlands, you'll easily see $3 per liter. So I highly encourage the gas price to climb to $3 and beyond in Alberta, and then we'll see if people still drive their Ram 3500 pickup truck around. But more importantly, we can use that $1.50 delta to invest in livable communities with public transit and where you can walk and bike everywhere, and it's going to be amazing. And then, of course, that stoked the counter argument of, well, what about all the folks that live in small town Alberta that don't want to change, and they just they have an identity with their pickup truck, and don't impose your unicorn and rainbow urbanist perspective on small towns in Alberta. I was like, yeah, I suppose that's right, but that's taking the whole thing out of context, So I guess the reason I'm sharing the story is because And the perspective really matters. Like I have the perspective of living in a already fairly walkable, livable community in my little bubble, and I have my social network of people that kind of think and breathe the same type of environment. So it really matters. And if you go to the Netherlands, yeah, there's certainly still lots of people driving their car around, except everyone's driving really small cars, and that's also that's perfectly normal and culturally acceptable. But if you take that Dutch person over here, everyone's like, oh, now I can drive a big truck around and it's going to be great, right? So like it's all, everyone has their own perspective where they live, I guess is where it comes down to. And
so what I've been trying to do is, so I always talk about their truck fetish. I always ask them about their truck fetish and when they start become a fetish person around trucks, and like when they acknowledge their truck fetish. That usually ends the conversation pretty quickly. So you have a truck fetish. Okay, tell me about your truck fetish. How does it, does it really excite you in ways when you can go through a McDonald's drive-through in a monster truck? And oh, that's cool, you have that truck fetish. Oh, I'm accepting of your differences. So that always always changes the conversation about it.
No, I'm a car guy, and like I like working on cars. I like cool cars and stuff like that. And when I talk to other like motor aficionados like that, right, they're some of the highest adopters of electric mobility because it's a performance conversation. And yeah, like maybe you're not going to get your stacks on the back of your pickup truck right now, but in a few years, like we're seeing the F-150 Lightning come out. It's obviously not a rural long distance farm truck yet. This is the first generation, right? And it hasn't been that long. So who knows where things go in the future? I think that those kinds of conversations are almost irrelevant in this context. Feelings are as a bit of a counterpoint to Brad on the feelings things. Feelings are important. They're part of the conversation, and you have to acknowledge them. But at some point, if we're talking about business decisions to invest in technologies, there's an emotional component to that, and then there's a desire for all of the stakeholders involved to try and park those emotions and get down to numbers. And when we do that, we have to figure out ways of not letting the feelings get back in and make sure that those numbers, that project makes sense, and that we're properly planning for how the culture is shifting so that project can be profitable.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I'm gonna circle back to the role of data and numbers as well. I think that's another area I'd love to dig into a little more. And yes, Julie, I want to bring you into the conversation as well. And Barend, you had talked about developing solutions with those that will use them and not imposing solutions on others. And I know, Julie, you've been doing a lot of work throughout your career at that community level. And yeah, I'd love to hear a little more around like what that means to develop solutions with those that will use them ultimately, or what it looks like to be developing the ultimate solutions at that collaboratively with the end users, and to what extent you've experienced that.
I think, and playing on what Barend said about talking about the messaging and the sentiment and the culture and identity that exists between very urban and rural dwellers and communities, I think is something important that does play into this, and that we do see in the adaptation or adoption of digital innovation and technologies and energy transition. You always see the big stories coming out of the big cities and the utilities and the players working in the big city centers, but there's a lot that goes on in small rural communities that you almost wouldn't expect because of the exact maybe cultural difference that a couple of the colleagues here have discussed. I think one of the really interesting examples that we saw more recently is the town of Raymond, Alberta, which is a very small rural farming community in southern Alberta, who has become one of Canada's first full net zero communities because they've offset, from a municipality's perspective, they've offset all of their municipal energy use with local solar. And it's not just about, it is a feel-good thing for them, but what drove them there was a couple of things. It was the economics of it. It's reduced energy costs for the municipality. It was social. It's brought economic development to their small town. They've had interviews and interest from around the world of what they've done with the net zero approach. And so it's even kind of these small rural farming communities are taking an approach of, it's about lowering their cost. It's about security, energy security and rates for their community. It's about the people side of things, not always about the technology and how flashy it is. It comes down to the basic instincts that everybody wants, even if it's not the electric vehicles and things like that. It's what's going to provide you with the things that makes your community healthy, happy, livable, resilient, and prosperous as we move forward. And so I think that there's a lot of really good examples of engaging with communities at that level and getting to the real core of what's important to them when we are trying to drive this change. And we see it with a number of projects, the Peaks to Prairies around electric vehicle supercharger stations across rural areas, of getting people to come for tourism purposes and for economic development to reach rural places as well. So I think there's definitely something there. Again, it comes to the people and the cultural aspect, more so that's driving the need for technology, not just the technology itself.
And I see that so often when we get out into some of the rural communities in Alberta. There's an excitement about connecting a future energy system that brings folks along, and the skills that they have and the jobs that they do, and that they can see themselves working in these types of projects that actually contribute and help us put ourselves onto the path to net zero. And, I go out to our site, which is, very central Alberta, in an area where there's a lot of rural communities around there. And, our operators are very skilled at what they do. They've been trained in the oil and gas industry and conventional traditional industries for most of their career. And then they've sort of upskilled to be looking at carbon management, and they're utilizing what they've brought from previous careers into this new operation. And they're excited about seeing that they've got value, they have the ability to improve and contribute, and that they're setting Alberta up for the future as well. And I think that's really exciting. I tell this story a lot to people, but in the city and in some of the urban areas, I've got friends who stay up at night worrying about climate change, and they feel disconnected from being able to actually contribute or influence, and they don't know what the solutions are. And they'll often ask me, like, why aren't you more worried? And I say, well, because I can go out and drive out there, and I can put my hand on that pipe and feel CO2 emissions going into our geology, knowing that they're being taken out of the atmosphere. And that gives me a lot of hope and confidence in our future, and being able to share that with more people, being able to see that reflected in sort of those rural communities, that they start getting excited about it, is really powerful.
Thanks, Candice. Go ahead.
Can I just briefly follow on the sort of the narrative here? And I recently was lucky to help write a report for Iron and Earth, which was another awesome project initiative. Well, actually, it's a whole organization now that supports fossil fuel and Indigenous workers and their community for that matter. And a lot of those communities are rural communities. Be a part of the energy transition. So there's a lot of talk globally around not just creating an energy transition for the affluent or an energy transition for those that are able to afford the transition, but then also making sure that the transition itself is inclusive. And I think making sure that it is inclusive and that it does allow opportunities for fossil fuel workers in particular that have a lot of the skill sets that are needed to build the infrastructure for a clean economy. It's super empowering. So like if you give a fossil fuel worker the opportunity to use their brilliant brains and their hands and their feet and whatever they got, rally a whole community around projects like the ones that Candice is describing, including renewable projects, grid renewal projects, then I think you've got success written on the wall.
Yeah, so I was going to say, Candice, your comments reminded me of a really interesting podcast that I was just listening to the other day. It's called Solvable. It's put out by Malcolm Gladwell's Shop Pushkin Industries, but it's like a different one of the podcasts. But anyway, the host, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but he was in a conversation with Gladwell about climate despondency, right? And they were talking about reframing it. And one of the most interesting observations Malcolm Gladwell had in that conversation, he's like, look, we have a generation that has grown up knowing full well that like there's been a bit of a fatalism around climate change. Like, we got to do something, but you look all around you and you're like, if you want to drive somewhere, you want to go on an airplane, you want to do this, do that. It's like, well, it's like, what are we going to do? Right? Like, I don't have any other options. I'm not going to stop living my life. So, I mean, what can we do? And the conversation has noticeably shifted. The culture has shifted in recent years. And the conversation has moved from this individual responsibility. You think about the early days of environmentalism in the 70s. We all have those, or if not our parents, but one of our friends' hippie parents that were ideological, fervent religious recyclers, or hanging their clothes out on a line because they didn't want to run the dryer. And now it's it's a systems level conversation, right? It's I know that my own personal choices are important, but it's not until the entire culture is moving in that way together, and the organizations that enable us to make those choices and present those choices to us are getting behind it, shift. And if you think about that culture shifting and observing it around us, the fact that we're having this conversation, there's this really, you start, what Malcolm observed is look, the CEOs of these companies aren't any different. They're in the culture too. So they're showing up at work every day, appreciating that this conversation is happening. And so, maybe it's not in their power to make whole scale shifts because they have to manage the systems within their company and manage the culture and the operations and make sure that the lights stay on. But their decisions are being influenced by this culture right now in a way that's really positive, and we need to celebrate that. It might not always be right, but again, getting back to that graphic of moving in all different directions and then having a conversation and then moving generally in the same direction, these things are happening, and it's awesome to see.
Agreed. We've seen a significant cultural shift in the last few years. We've lived it, and yet at the same time, I find there's still often these areas and these topics where, and you started to raise earlier, Matt, the role of data. It's not just feelings. At some point, there's a need for the business case, there's a need for the numbers. But how do we navigate when the apparent facts on an issue completely conflict? How I'd be curious if any of you have, I'll just pose this to the group, have experience with then trying to navigate what has started as a fact-based conversation, but it's just purely there doesn't appear to be a bridge because your facts and my facts they're just so wide apart. Any thoughts on that?
I'm just reflecting on a conversation I've had at eSource talking about electrification. So I mentioned there's a huge push to electrify not just vehicles, right, but also heating in buildings. And depending on where you are in Canada and the US, heating a building with a heat pump might make sense from a carbon perspective. But if your electricity price is really high and you need a lot of heating, even a heat pump just doesn't add up dollars and cents wise. But if you broaden the scope of the dollars and cents, so I'm using this story because if you define your scope in a certain way, then maybe the numbers point in one direction. But if you broaden it or look at it from a slightly different perspective, then the dollars and cents will tell you something else, right? So it really, again, depends on that perspective of how you look at a problem for the economics and the numbers to work out in favor of a certain decision. Using this problem of heating with heat pumps, the dollars and cents might not work out from an economic perspective if you just look at it from the rate that the building owner is paying. But then if you look at, well, what value does that new load on the grid bring in terms of load flexibility, in terms of grid resiliency, what value does the carbon bring? What value does the economic, there's a lot of jobs that are associated with overhauling that infrastructure as well. So there's various other angles of the story that you can look at. And if you can value all those, in the utility space, it's called non-energy benefits. If you can value all those non-energy benefits, you can actually change the rules. And so this goes back to Matt Beck's argument around governance, right? You can change those governance rules to actually make it work out in the end that you can then pay, like the governance system can pay the upfront cost of these new retrofits to create the jobs, to create the clean energy systems, so that it offsets potentially the slightly higher cost of electricity that the user has to pay for that heat pump. But again, it's that perspective, like how broad do you take the scope and what angle do you look at a problem?
I think timing is also important. Oh, sorry, is that kind of?
Brad?
Yeah, I think timing is also one of those things when you sit there, because a lot of the time when you're talking about solutions and data and they just fundamentally don't work, the question is in what time frames and how will this change? Because I think in a lot of the time that conversation, and I'm taking this as, I'm going to switch from being more the feelings person to the more analytical side. When you're sitting there hammering out data, the question is based on your assumptions and timing. Because a lot of the time it's timing. Like, is this how it is today? How will that change, right? Because a lot of the time that will shift the conversation to saying, you're probably right for the first 2 years, but year 3 to on is, I'm probably right, right? And I think that's a very good thing to recognize, is that it's because we like to solve solutions that, to solve problems that were problems last year, not the problems we're about to face. So I think it's important to really contextualize the conversation with a time element, because then hopefully you can depolarize that conversation.
Building on that timing thing, there's, I see that very much part of the scoping conversation that Barend was referring to as well. Time is one variable. There's so many different variables we have to manage these scope conversations on to get us somewhere where we have common ground. But another important thing thinking about timing is it's not necessarily just about, short-term versus long-term, but, I'm reminded of this week actually, or this month, the IEA released the new 2021 World Energy Outlook. And they're talking a lot about, either, fossil fuels being in a plateau situation or a decline, depending on the policies that we see enacting going forward. There was also a recent article I was pointed to discussing this idea of an oil plateau, right? And in a plateau market, you are more likely to see fluctuations in pricing and output and demand supply. Like the demand and the supply are cycling on a tighter frequency And so you see a little bit more of the volatility than like a big long upswing and a big long decline and things like that, right? And so the timing is also in a much more short-term way, knowing that, you know, it's almost like, you know, when you're scuba diving in the ocean and there's a big swell, right? And you gotta time your kicks and you're swimming with the swell, so you're not fighting the current. So if you know there's a big price upswing and everyone's getting really excited, and your technology is something that is you know, and presenting an alternative to that commodity that's on an upswing, maybe that's not the right time to really push hard. But maybe it's like, if you can sense that you know that's going to come back, find that right time when people are willing to listen and they're not scrambling and focused on capturing the most value of that latest cycle.
Thank you all. I'm just looking at the time. I can't believe we're already near the end of our session together. I think we could spend all day together talking. I'd love to be able to do that, but I think I think it's time we move towards some closing comments. I do want to give you each a chance just to reflect on. We've covered a lot of bases today. We've talked a lot culture. We've touched on regime, both from the perspective of business and markets, and particular utilities, as well as a little bit around the regulatory environment, and then the kind of challenges for at that innovator level amidst all of these. But there was lots of important tips and advice today. But would just invite each of you to share just sort of one takeaway, whether it's just something you want to reinforce, or anything new that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to mention. That would be welcome as well. And so I'll go to you first, Candice.
Sure. Thanks, Allison. I think the main takeaway for me is when I think about how the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line project was started. I mean, this was over a decade ago, and where it is today, you know, we're sequestering 1.5 million emissions, or 1.5 million tons of CO2 per year. That's like 350,000 cars off the road. It's big. And I've seen a massive shift in the culture of the company to where we are today. 10 years ago, this is a brilliant team of skilled engineers and business people and everybody that's needed to make a project like this happen. And they are heads down focused on technical execution and doing a project well. And that's brought them to where they are today. But the world is shifting. And we're seeing that, you know, heads down technical execution just doesn't cut it anymore. That idea of you need to go beyond technology. There are other barriers that can get in your way, no matter how great or how well known or how commercially ready something is. And that's really the genesis of this Alberta Carbon Hub project, and that needing to be collaborative, needing to make connections, needing to have these conversations, not only at, you know, the government table, not only at the boardroom table, but at that kitchen table where people are, and connecting with the broader communities as a whole is so important for these solutions to come into reality. And so I'm really excited about it. I think just seeing a company like mine who can execute on projects also start to move into these sorts of cultural spaces, these conversational spaces, and proactively start to collaborate is a really exciting thing.
Thank you, Candice. Barend?
Yeah, I was trying to think of what amazing nugget I can leave behind with everyone. But the one thing I think that is important to me is to find purpose. And it's not just purpose for myself and what I do, but to be part of a community. In this case, you know, I spend at least 8 hours a day working with an amazing team of people at eSource. I work with an amazing group of folks at the Grit Sandbox, and we all have a vision for how we can contribute to climate action, decarbonizing our energy systems. For some other folks, like my partner, she's at the food bank and she's serving a purpose to the local community, making sure that everyone has access to, you know, healthy, affordable food choices. So I think that's really important. I think you can rally your tribe, your community around a purpose. And I encourage everyone to find that for themselves.
Thanks, Barend. Julie?
If I had to leave everybody with something today, it's that, when we're trying to look at how we use social innovation to unlock the digital innovation possibilities and solutions that are out there. Looking at the social innovation, the new business models, the innovative policy and regulatory framework, the economics of it, the new collaborations and partnerships. One of the things that you can't undervalue is, and how important it is creating the space to have these discussions around collaboration. Is so often we've worked in our electricity system and energy system has worked in a very siloed approach, and everyone's trying to get to this certain place on their own. Places like this lab and other spaces where people are coming together and starting to become more aligned on how we move this forward together, seeing utilities and communities and regulators and innovators coming together in a space and needing to create that space to have that open dialogue on how we move forward is incredibly important and what is helping us, I think. So creating that space to have these discussions around social innovation, it takes all of us. It's going to take a lot of people and a lot of minds coming together to make it happen successfully.
Thank you, Julie. Brad, we'll go to you.
I think my final thoughts is kind of what I've been saying. Don't let culture surprise you. It's super important and often overlooked. And the biggest indication you're dealing with a culture issue is feels. And sometimes people talk about things as data, but a lot of the time it comes back to the feeling and the culture imprint that's around it. So that's a big thing to be conscious about it and be deliberate. When you're talking to people, make sure you get outside your echo chamber to talk to people that aren't in your circles and just ask them, well, what do you feel about this? Which is a very odd conversation for people who are technically minded, but you'll gain a lot of knowledge that a lot of the times you're not seeing technical barriers, but you may perceive them as technical barriers, but they're actually cultural barriers, and you need to work on those ones. And so that's why I say it would be to be conscious of that and to be very deliberate of when you're talking and communicating with people outside your echo chamber to document those feels.
Thank you, Brad. Matt?
So, I heard a lot of really optimistic conversation about, some of these tools. If we use these tools, we can kind of break through some of the stuff and accelerate our transition to the society that the future really needs of us. At the same time, I kind of reflect on the fact that 20 years ago, when I was starting planning out what I'm going to do when I grow up, like graduating and going to university and stuff and getting into my career in sustainability, we had a lot of that optimism too, and sometimes it feels like the progress isn't there, right? And I don't want to lose sight of that, because I'm very conscious of, now I'm this, middle-aged professional in the space, and youth are coming up and saying, you guys are just talking about all these things that we need to do, and it's incremental and it's not big enough. And I want to challenge us that, these tools are just one piece of the problem. The scale and pace that these changes need to happen in order to meet our commitments to avoid these major society shifting impacts that we're facing are huge and sometimes seem impossible. And we can't forget that it's not enough to just kind of noodle around with like, what's this next one? We have to act. We have to act now. We have to act urgently and boldly. And it may seem impossible, but the thing I would want everyone to leave on is the greatest events, developments, new technologies in our society throughout history started off in somebody's mind or in somebody's project seeming like they were impossible until they weren't. And so it's okay for it to seem that way as long as we're working on it. Just keep pushing away and accelerating that effort. It's going to happen. We got to have faith in that.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for that reminder as well of the urgency of on these issues that I think we all feel. But I think what I wanted to contribute to that is that does feel uncomfortable, right? Like it's and working in this space and on these issues when we're pushing boundaries is going to feel uncomfortable. And I think that's actually another of those feelings that we have to, one of the practices that we need to have as individuals is leaning into that discomfort, because if we're going to get anywhere near to moving fast enough, it does need to be uncomfortable as well. And so kind of normalizing and inviting that as well. So with that, thank you, each of you, so much for your time today, for your insightful comments. I think there's so much that we I think can leave the audience with today. And I thank you all each for as well for modeling sort of constructive exploration on some of these challenging topics as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you very much.